Welcome everyone, and thanks very much Media Tell for having us. Mental health, it feels like a really important topic to be talking about in World Mental Health Day this week. And only yesterday it was coming up in the debates that I saw between all of the media leaders. So DE&I and the talent crisis was two of the topics that reached the top three most important things that we need to focus on next year. So it feels like a really relevant conversation to be having with Sue Todd today. So my name's Sampson, and I'm an independent consultant, and I'd like to introduce Sue Todd, who is CEO of NABS, my former boss, a mentor, as Andy was saying in the last conversation, and a friend. Sue, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit more before we dive into the
Yeah, totally. This is all very weird for us. It's funny when you're interviewed by a friend and an ex-colleague, but a very welcome change. Yeah, hello everyone. As Anna said, I've been the NABS CEO this is my 5th month, I think. I have worked in media companies and for and with media companies the whole of my career, sort of 25 odd years. Some of the best cultures around, both in agencies, media owner, I've been a consultant, outdoor, telly, audio or radio as it was when I worked in it. But also I've been mainly in marketing roles or people and culture roles, sort of change roles. But I guess at the time, the advice from the last panel I thought was really interesting about, the climbing frame rather than the ladder and kind of going out and coming in, because I've done lots of that. I went out and ran my own business for 8 years, and then I thought I wouldn't come back in, although I was working for businesses in the sector, and then I did. But when I look back now, I can see that the common thread was actually that I did choose to work for great cultures and great bosses. I had a sort of sixth sense that it was really important that the direct person I worked for was someone that believed in the things I believed in and would give me enough room and autonomy and support to be good at what I thought I was good at and to help me grow. So I've been really fortunate in that sense. But I think all roads have sort of been leading to NABS, because what really fascinates me, I suppose, is sort of human behaviour, why we do the things we do, and how we can create environments and teams where people get the chance to fulfil their full potential, which I know you've probably heard every leader that's ever run a business say, but I think in this context of advancing mental wellness for our sector and all the things we heard yesterday about the talent crisis and diversity inclusion, this for me is the central idea, that if we can advance all of our mental wellness as opposed to just get to a point where we're in a mental health crisis, then we'll all thrive, and the community of advertising and media will continue to do as well as it has for the last 25 years.
So the last session focused very much on what it takes to be a media leader. What do you think the topic of mental health adds to that, and why is it important to that debate?
Well, I think things have changed so much in the last 10 years in terms of this is a mainstream conversation. 1 in 4 of us will claim to have a mental health challenge at some point in our lives. That is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people in our community, in our industry, that to some degree will feel that their mental health is challenged at some point in their working careers. All in the work that the AA do has helped us measure that, and we now have a kind of regular sense of how many people are feeling that challenge, which I think is really important, and helps us come together as a community to see how we're doing on the topic. I mean, fundamentally, I think I tend to say mental wellness rather than mental health, which feels like semantics, but I think there's still a perception that mental health is something that you deal with when you're in a crisis. And although, NABS and our own employers and our bosses, of course, we want to create a culture where people are there to help us when there is something life-changing or extremely difficult within work or out of work that really causes us problems and we need to get support from in work. The reality is that I think if we can change the conversation to we are all thinking about our mental wellness all the time, and particularly as leaders, we're encouraging those conversations, then I think we've got a chance of catching a lot of those issues before they become a crisis, and just getting rid of the stigma, I suppose. So I think from a leadership perspective, it's kind of essential. It links to all the things that I heard yesterday about talent and diversity and inclusion. It's particularly related to. So I think it's sort of the central idea that I think will support the industry in thriving forward. I suppose for advertising and media, I do have a sense that although this is a topic that's hitting everybody everywhere, I mean, the last 3 years have been tough for everybody. There's uncertainty and change globally. I do feel that advertising and media are sort of they're at the hard and fast end of change. I think we do get hit with change first sometimes, whether it's social or cultural changes, you know, from Black Lives Matter and how we adapt as content creators and advertisers and people who are, you know, thinking about how media relates to those cultural and social topics. But I also think we're at the hard end, as the last panel said, of constant skill innovation. You know, the digital constant need to be learning and getting better and asking questions and saying I don't understand, I think just means that, you know, that level of change and the pace of that change, I think makes mental wellness a particularly important topic for our sector, because I think we are at the hard and fast end of constant change and constant uncertainty. I mean, it's one of the great things about our sector, and it's why I've stayed working here, because I think we do pick up and deal with, and I'm proud of it, some of those big changes around us fast. But I think for individuals and for teams and for businesses, I think it can mean that it's a lot of change at once, and it feels like that at the moment. And I think the data, in terms of, you know, things I've seen this week from Utopia, an agency who I know released a new report this week, I've seen some McKinsey work, but also from our own sector, would say that it's pretty prevalent and we need to keep an eye on it.
I like the way you've talked about it as a universal theme that's super relevant right now, and you started to touch a little bit on diversity and inclusion. I want to dive into that a bit more. How do you think the challenges vary when you layer in that other subtopic of diversity and inclusion around kind of mental health issues?
Yeah, I mean, there's absolutely no question. I mean, there's been lots of data. Again, the AA's All-In survey told us this. Our own research, Diversity in Focus did, and the Utopia research I mentioned that was released on Monday on World Mental Health Day, all say that for more underrepresented and marginalised groups, mental health is a bigger challenge. There seems to be lots of reasons why, and I think some of it is to do with, the research is saying, to do with more masking, feeling less able to speak up, not necessarily feeling they fit into that culture, and therefore it's more difficult to raise those conversations. So I think it is really important to measure in organisations and to think about the fact that smaller groups who are not the majority are probably suffering, if they, you know, from mental health challenges the most. But that data in those groups and that sense of who's suffering can be cut a number of ways. So the McKinsey study that I saw this week said that from burnout's been talked about a lot this week around World Mental Health Day. And I think their data shows that women will claim to be feeling more burnt out at the moment than men, slightly. But then middle income managers were the group that were feeling burnout in work the highest, which I think reflects the conversation we were just listening to from the last panel, and some of the things I heard yesterday about that middle management group and how they're really feeling the pressure of, you know, clients and work and tasks, but making sure their teams are okay and that they're okay. And I think there might be something in at that level for not feeling completely empowered yet to have the conversation that they also might be struggling with some of these challenges and some of these topics, because they're complex, they're hard, they're not the easiest things to admit to sometimes. Whereas I think maybe more senior leaders, if you've been around the block a little bit longer, might feel a little bit more comfortable talking about their own mental wellness, which I think is really important. But I do sense that the middle managers, and the McKinsey study just bear this out, are really feeling it right now. And I think that's part of what we have to respond to and make sure they feel that they can open up that conversation about themselves and be tooled up to help their teams and people as well.
Yeah, that McKinsey study is really worth looking at, and it does make a middle management point, so I recommend reading it and also listening to what Jan Gooding said on this topic yesterday. Yeah. That middle management piece is really key, I think, Sue. Totally agree. Let's sort of dive in a bit more detail into the topic of culture. I'm really interested to understand from your perspective the notion of kind of cultural fit, which certainly when I started out in media 20 years ago, and you were thinking about recruiting new talent into your team, that was one of the things that you were asked to consider. You know, does this person culturally fit within this organisation and this team? And I wonder if that idea of cultural fit needs a bit of a shake-up in the context of all these conversations about mental health and diversity and inclusion. So what do you think about that, Sue?
I think it's a really interesting topic. I mean, I've been lucky to work in some amazing cultures in media over the last 20 years. Where I've definitely felt, you know, connected and a sense of belonging, and that we were stronger together. And I think it is part of what great businesses do well. But I think possibly the thing that's changed and is changing, and the conversation we're now having, is that if we create cultures that are too exclusive and, you know, suit a certain type of person, by its very nature, that means some group is excluded. And I think this conversation about more inclusive cultures is really interesting because maybe instead of, I think probably what I did 10 years ago if I was hiring and explaining to someone what my team or my organisation that I represented's culture was like and asking the candidate, how they felt about that culture and whether they fit into that culture and whether it matched with their sense of what they liked or wanted to be a part of. I think the better question to now ask when you're interviewing people is to ask the candidates, when they felt most included or felt a strongest sense of belonging at work, and ask them why and where that was. And I think if we do that and flip it slightly, what we find out is that you can create very strong cultures with a really clear sense of connection, community, and belonging that are based on really broad values that make sure more people feel included in that culture or that way of doing things. So I think it's totally doable. I think it's a really interesting conversation because we're all inclined to tribes and groups, and that's essentially what the word culture means. We have common behaviours or common norms or ways of doing things. But I think in a sort of with the challenges that we face as an industry and what we're all trying to do in terms of valuing difference, and the last panel hit on lots of the things that I think we're all trying to do and understand lots more than we did 10 years ago, from neurodiversity to some of the challenges that middle managers face as opposed to senior managers, or from different marginalised groups or protected groups. I think we're all just a bit more cognizant and conscious that if we define things too tightly, by that very definition means some people will feel they're excluded from it. And it's sort of fine as long as it's not the marginalised or the minority groups that have value to add. Yeah. So, the bottom line is those people, everybody needs to be included in that conversation. Rather than maybe what used to happen, I'm not 100% sure, is that those things used to get defined by senior management. And I think we've shifted on that and we've changed that conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly felt to me yesterday when I was watching all the speakers and the diverse range of talent that was on the platform, that there was just a richness to the conversation that you don't always see when you come to conferences when there's lots of familiar faces. I really welcomed the opportunity to meet some new people yesterday, and it felt like it made that conversation more interesting and that we could all learn as a result of it. So I think that's a really interesting place to be, and it's about being curious about meeting new people, I guess.
Yeah, definitely, and valuing difference, which I do think is a conversation that this industry is having and had for the last 5 years particularly, which is really important. Back to the point about, as a sector, media and advertising gets hit with change first, I think, and hard. Yeah. So I think we are really good at opening up those dialogues and having them. But obviously there's still work to do because the data's telling us that there's still people who don't feel included and don't feel like they belong. So, we've got to keep measuring it, keep talking about it, and keep being honest about where we're not currently doing well enough.
So I'm going to dive into that sort of work to be done piece, I think, because I think that's really interesting. We're on a journey here, aren't we?
Yeah.
And what can the industry do to drive that change and create the necessary support structures?
Well, I mean, I think we have lots of support structures. I think the conversations I have with lots of businesses who I know are represented in this room today are that they have their own programs to support employee well-being more than we probably did 5 or 10 years ago. So I think we are definitely moving in the right direction. I think we've made it a central conversation for people individually and collectively to talk about mental health and mental wellness, which I think is important. I think from a leadership perspective, it's really important to keep checking in on yourself and with others. I think the last panel talked about being open, being vulnerable. We hear a lot about being your authentic self at work. I think leaders have a massive responsibility to do that. I think we are all more comfortable. We're all people who can be affected by lots of things in and out of work. And I think the checking in on yourself and others is the most important thing that I think we can do. But NABS is your kind of your independent charity that supports all these, has advice lines, free therapy, free coaching, lots of masterclasses on this topic and others. So, there is a resource beyond even your own teams or your own bosses or your own companies that is there to support you. So I would say get in touch with NABS if you as a leader, manager or individual are feeling like you'd like to get better or you'd like to talk about any of these issues, because that's what we're there to do for everybody in this room.
So very briefly, because we're running out of time, a lot to take in here, Sue, really rich conversation, but if people are going away and back to their desk, what would be the kind of one thing that you would say to take away and action as a result of listening to this mental health conversation?
I mean, I think you have to measure it. I think you have to, as a company, as a team, as an individual, you have to measure it. I think you have to check in and ask the questions of yourself and of others. you know, it's all about creating safe spaces to have conversations so that people don't get rid of the stigma, so that it helps people talk about things before they're a crisis, when it's just in the prevention stage. You know, I'm definitely an advocate of that. But, you know, if you're feeling it, obviously, you know, people leave people, as someone just said in the last panel. They don't necessarily leave companies. I think Andy said it. And I think that's really true. So, you know, when you're going for a new job, I think, you know, make sure the person you're going to work for is someone who shares these values. I mean, it's good to ask people about how they feel about their mental wellness and what they do individually to make sure it's maintained and balanced. You know, we've all got our own strategies, I think. And I think it's good to share that with people in terms of what we find works and just open up that conversation. Safe conversation is the most important thing. Or contact NABS if you need some help and advice, because that's what we're there for.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Anna.